And we are live. Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar with the topic measuring crop height with drones. My name is Igor. I'm a founder of Solvi, and with me today is our guest, Thiago Marconi from Digital Phenotyping Ag Services. Thiago, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yes, thank you, Igor. So my name is Thiago Marconi. Like Igor said, I'm the founder of Digital Phenotyping Ag Services, and I'm happy to be here today for this webinar.
Perfect. So today we'll be talking about how to measure crop height using drone images, and this is a topic that I'm really excited about, and we have a lot of people from all over the world who registered for today's webinar, which clearly shows that there is interest for this topic. It is still quite new. We all of us learn as we go on how it works, what the best practices are. So today we'd like to cover some theoretical parts of that. So if we look at today's agenda, we'll have three parts of this webinar. So in the first part, I'll be talking about the theory behind the crop height measurements with drones, explain how it works, what the best practices for data collection are, and show a few insights from research that is done on that topic. After that, Thiago will talk about real-world examples from their work, how they have been doing this type of measurements in three different scenarios, three different crops in forestry, sugarcane, and sweet potato. And after that, we will have a Q&A session. So if you have any questions along the presentations, there is a Q&A tool at the bottom of Zoom interface here. So you can post your questions there, and after the presentations, we will try to answer as many as possible. And with us today is also my colleague Matteo, who will be closely monitoring the questions that you ask and help us pick as many questions as possible in the end and get them answered. All right. And then also from the practical things, so this webinar is being recorded. So if you can make it until the end, we will send the link to the recording, most likely tomorrow. So you will be able to rewatch it until the end. All right. So first, I would like to share a few words about myself and Solvi. So I'm Igor, I'm founder of Solvi. And for those who don't know, Solvi is a web-based service for analysis of drone imagery with focus on agriculture and more specifically on field trials. And I started the company over 10 years ago, back in 2015. It was in the beginning a pilot project together with the Swedish University of Agricultural Science, and that's where we also based in Gothenburg in Sweden. And back then, if you have been in the industry already, you know how the state of the technology looked like. It was not as easy as today to just put the drone in the air and collect good data. You had to mount the cameras, custom-made cameras on the drones, collect the imagery, and then when it comes to data processing, it was not as straightforward as today either. So that's kind of how everything started, with the goal of streamlining the process of data processing and analysis. And over the years, we have refined our analytics. And today we have clients a bit all over the world with main markets in Europe and North America, and work mainly with researchers, agronomists, and service providers who work with field trials. And at the core of our product is the tool called Plant AI that allows non-technical people to train their custom AI models for the different types of crops and extract metrics like the stem counts, density maps, plant level data like size and health for the individual plants, do weed detections, and a few other things. And specifically for the research, we have an area of analytics with tools like zonal statistics that streamlines the whole workflow of creating the plot boundaries, calculating plot level metrics, and then, of course, extracting plot level data and downloading a CSV file or even integrate via API. So that's about us. And now to the topic of this webinar. So I would like in the beginning to just pose a question that probably many of you are wondering. So can drone measurements compare to the traditional manual measurements? And if so, how accurate are they? So that's the question that we'll try to answer today and provide you with a few examples. But before we dive into that, first, let's ask as a question, why even bother trying to use drones for that? And if you watched our previous webinars about plant counts, this is kind of goes along the same lines. All the manual assessments, many of the assessments in the field trials are very time consuming. So if you want to collect metrics like crop height or plant counts for each plot, it takes probably a few minutes for at least for each plot, and a field trial can have hundreds or even thousands of plots. So to collect data in qualitative amounts, it will probably take a team of several people, a couple of hours or even days, which is of course very time consuming. But then also manual measurements can be inconsistent. People do their own judgments and may make the measurements slightly different. So you never know for 100% if it's actually the difference in the metrics or if it's something subjective that someone measured in a certain way. In some cases, if you have a very dense canopy in the field trials, some areas of the trials may even not be easily accessible on the foot. And then finally, when you do measurements in the field manually, that's the only chance that you can do some sort of measurements or estimate. If you down like a week from that time point in time discover that something was wrong, there is no way to go back and revisit it. So you have to live with their data. With the drones, you collect the data once, and you can always revisit it even a year from the initial data collection. And if you notice any change in the algorithm or something inaccuracy, you can always go back and do the tweaks and reprocess the data. But with the drones, it's also much more faster to collect the data. So one person can go out in a field trial, collect imagery in maybe a 30 minutes flight, and then go back to the office, process it, and in another few hours extract a bunch of different metrics, including health, counts, crop height, and so on. So there are definitely benefits of using drone-based measurements, as you can see from this slide. But how does it actually work in practice? Because if you are especially new to this technology, you may be wondering, like drones collect the images, you can see things in it. The images represent reflectance of the crops on the ground, but how do you actually measure the height from them? And the answer to that is a process called photogrammetry, which includes a bunch of different algorithms that the images are run through when they're being processed. So this is a heavy computational process that takes some time, sometimes 15 minutes to process, sometimes half an hour, maybe hour, or even several hours if it's a large data set with a lot of images. But the idea behind that is that when you map a field trial, you collect the images with overlap. Typically 70 to 80% overlap is recommended. And when these images then are run through the photogrammetry pipeline through a bunch of different steps, the images are compared to each other, common features are extracted and matched, and each pixel from the images is observed from the different angles. And by using that approach, it can then be positioned in a 3D space. And before we create a map that you can look at and do different analytics on, we actually create something called point cloud. So a 3D representation of the field. So if you look at this point cloud from the side, you can clearly see how the plots stand out. And that's because each point in this point cloud, which consists of millions of points typically, it has its X, Y, and Z coordinates in 3D space. And from that point cloud, then we generate essentially two outputs. So one of them is orthomosaic, so the visual map or multispectral map that can be used for crop health analysis. But also we generate a 2D representation of this 3D map, which is also called DSM, Digital Surface Model. And in this map, compared to the visual orthomosaic, each pixel has not a reflectance value, but elevation value. So each pixel has a a value that represents typically altitude above sea level. And this is a really valuable data source that can then be used for crop height measurements. I mentioned briefly DSM, Digital Surface Model, but there are actually two other terms that are very important to understand because that then plays a big role in how you actually do the height measurements, as there are a few different methods. First, DSM and DTM. So DSM is what is created after every imagery processing, so the default output. And it's essentially an elevation map that represents the terrain of the field, but then also all the objects on top of it. So if there are crops in the field, they become part of a digital surface model. If there are some trees or even man-made objects like cars, houses, or even if there are people in the imagery, they will all be represented in this elevation map. And that's typically not very useful for height measurements because you kind of want to know just the height of the crops and without taking into account possible variations in terrain. And then DTM is something that can be produced from DSM. And there are different methods. There are some methods for classifications already in the point cloud creation process. But there are also some methods that I will work through in a few minutes where you can essentially discard all those objects that are on top of the terrain and just get the terrain of the field. And also worth mentioning that a DSM collected or created in the early growth stage. So if you, for example, before the crop emergence, it automatically becomes a DTM because there are no crops on top of it. So it actually, like the same elevation map can be both DSM and DTM. And then most importantly, what is especially useful in crop height measurements is something called CHM, Canopy Height Model. And that's essentially the difference between the DSM and DTM. So if we subtract pixel by pixel in the two maps, one from another, we get the difference. And that's what can be really useful for crop height measurements because then we can simply take the numbers from the Canopy Height Model and that will include just the height of the crops and not possible variations in the terrain. So now that we know these three different types of elevation maps, how can the measurements actually be done? And there are actually three different ways. Probably there are some others as well, but the most common ones and the ones that we implement in Solvi. So the first method, which can use just DSM, is for cases when you have a field trial with crops in the plots, and outside of each plot, the ground level is clearly visible. Then the algorithm that we use can automatically buffer each plot by a certain amount, like half a meter or meter, and then look for the lowest point within this buffered area and use that as a ground level from which to measure the height. But that works only in cases like this where you have very clear gaps between the plots or group of plots and can clearly identify ground level for each individual plot. The second method uses the Canopy Height Model that I mentioned before, but the Canopy Height Model can also be created by two different methods. So the second method is for cases when you don't have this early growth stage flight with the bare soil surface. But in a field trial, you probably have visible points with the ground level visible across the whole trial in different locations. Then with this second method that we also offer in Solvi, you simply put the reference point and tell essentially the tool what the ground level is. And then the elevation values are interpolated between the points and the DTM, the terrain model, is created based on that. This is not like 100% accurate method, and in cases like this, it can actually be a bit questionable if there are very large areas with no bare soil visible. There might be some variations in height that get missed, and the height measurements based on that can be less accurate. For cases like this, a better approach, if possible, because not everyone have the possibility to collect this early stage imagery, but it's to create a canopy height model from a DTM from created in the early growth stage flight. So in this image, we can see what a DTM can look like in a cornfield right after the emergence. Like some plants already emerged, but they don't make a huge difference. So you can say that you still see just the terrain. And in this field, there are clearly some variations in the terrain of the field. And when the data was collected then later in the season, when we actually wanted to do the height measurements over here at the bottom in August 13th, uh, it kind of shows. So this is a DSM and it shows the variations, but it's quite clear here that they actually represent the same thing that this early stage flight. So the bump here is actually a higher terrain in the field, and it's not like that the crops are higher in this part of the field. But then when we create the CHM from these two data layers, so subtract DTM from DSM, we get this third map, Canopy Height Model, that now more accurately represents the height of the crops. So those are the three different methods, and I just wanted to quickly switch to a quick demo from one of the trials that Thiago has been working with, just to show what it looks like in real application. So this is a sugarcane trial, and this is what the DSM looks like. And in this field, there are clear differences from the lowest point here in the north and the higher points here in the south. And over here in the settings for the elevation map, we can switch between the different types of elevation maps. But first of all, so in cases like this, as I mentioned before, when the gaps between the plots are clearly visible, the most straightforward option is to just use this method for height calculation that we call ground outside zone, which means that for every plot, the algorithm will look for the lowest level outside of each plot within that buffered area. There is also sometimes it can be interesting to look within the plot. So that's, for example, for vegetable trials on raised beds. So you don't want to look outside of the raised bed. You just want to find the lowest level within the plot. So in cases like this, it would work well, even without using those other two methods. But just to show how it works here, if we go to the elevation tool again and click create DTM, there is an option to use an early stage DSM, and then in this case it can also quite easily be created just from reference points by putting them throughout the whole field trials. And then we get the DTM that shows how the elevation varies throughout the field, and from that the CHM can be also generated. All right, so now back to my slides. So which method to use when? Just a quick recap. If you have cases like I just showed, the ground level outside of each plot clearly visible, method one is the quickest and simplest one. You don't need to do much. Just create plot boundaries and then calculate crop height right away. In closed canopies, but where you still have some ground level visible here and there, and it's somewhat evenly spread across the field trial, the second method can work. You just place reference points and create a DTM from that, and then generate a canopy height model. Or for cases like this, where you don't, like there are vast areas in the field trials without any ground level visible, reference points will not work well. So then you will need an early stage elevation map that you can use to create a canopy height model. So a few words about the best practices for the data collection, because as you by this point probably understand that the single most important factor that affects the accuracy of height measurements is the quality of these elevation maps. If they don't turn out well and don't represent what it looks like in the field, then all the measurements, whichever method you use for height measurements, will not help. And the quality of the elevation map mainly depends on a few factors. So it's the overlap of that you collect the imagery with. So that's something that you put in the flight planning app when you do the flight plan. Usually you want to use slightly higher overlap for if you're planning to do height measurements. So 80% front overlap and 75% side overlap is recommended at least. Some of our users are further using even 85-85. But that's of course a question of the feasibility. So if you have a very large field trial and set the overlap very high, it might be very time consuming to collect the data. Then you want to also avoid windy condition during the flight. So if you're flying over tall crops like corn, for example, and the crops move as the drone flies over them, that can introduce the artifacts in the elevation map, and some of the parts of the elevation map will simply be missing the values. And then if this automatic crop height measurements with method one is not working, it's really recommended that you use RTK drone so that you can compare the elevation map over time. Or if you don't have an RTK drone, you can use RTK measured ground control points to achieve the same thing. And then I would like to mention a few words on what the research tells us, how accurate these drone-based height measurements can be. So first, a few papers here that came to the conclusion that it can be quite accurate. And here they tried in different crops, cotton, maize, and soybean, with different methods. The ones that I described before, some even used the LiDAR method. But as you can see, all of them achieved quite outstanding numbers here. And what contributed to success in these cases are mainly the RTK georeferencing. So they were able to compare use the DTM from the early stage flights to then create canopy height models. Tall upright crops, so with well-defined canopy structure, that is usually results in high quality elevation maps. And then also when the ground level outside of the plots is clearly visible, that of course also contributes a lot to the success of the height measurements. But it doesn't always, of course, come without any problems. There are cases where the height measurements don't work well. So there is a study in dry bean conducted 2 years ago, which came to conclusion that short canopy. So if dry bean crops that are just 30-50 centimeters in size, in height, it's very hard to measure them accurately because there is some error margin already built into the height measurement. So if the crops themselves are not very, very tall, then it's really challenging to measure the height of them accurately. And then in this specific case study, they were not successful in using consistent georeferencing between the different flights. So they couldn't really reuse the DSMs from the previous flight to establish the ground level. So that also was one of the reasons why the results didn't turn out well. And then they tried to compensate it with trying to find the ground level within the plots, but then had challenges with the canopy being very, very dense, and that of course doesn't work well either. So that's some theory, and now I would like to hand over the word to Thiago, who will talk about the real-world examples from the project that they've been working on in different crops and share his insights with us. Thiago?
Thank you, Igor. Let me share my screen here. Can you see my screen?
Yes, perfect.
Okay. Just give me 1 second. Okay. So thank you, Igor, for the introduction there. That's a perfect segue for my uh, other part of the seminar here. So I'm going to present 3 examples of work that we have done with a few clients and collaborators that we have in our company here. Okay. So like I said, my name is Thiago Marconi. I'm part of the Digital Phenotyping Ag Services. So we are a company based in US and a company also based in Brazil. So we provide drone services for data extraction, for breeding trials, product evaluation, stress monitoring, and yield-related analytics. Okay, so our main core here is not the image itself, but actually the data that we extracted from the image. Okay, so as by training here, I'm a researcher, I'm a plant breeder, so I use these tools here every day in my work, and I also try to help my colleagues here in the research area to be more used to this kind of data here, right? But the main topics here and the main goals here is basically what things we need to accomplish here is first, as Igor was explaining, it's very important for us when we are doing data collection to standardize how we're doing this data collection with the drones. As any research data, we need a protocol. So as well as for image acquisition, we also need a protocol and a standardized protocol to collect that data to provide later quality on the data that we're extracting, right? Then later we do plot segmentation. So we're talking about very small plots in research sites that we extract data from. So images coming from drones where we have resolutions from 1 to 3 centimeters. This is perfect to extract even from single plant data to small plots. And then we can extract any trait that we are looking for. So basically, including, like Igor already mentioned, height, we can extract other vegetation indexes that we can measure over time, the growth of the plant, the stress response, or either biotic or abiotic stresses from the environment, and even management practices, right? Treatment effects that we apply, and we can see and use actually the plant as a sensor of the environment to tell us what's going on, right? And measure the growth. So this data is very important, right, to provide support for decisions, either on breeding or agronomy or even product development, right? If you're designing a new nutritional product that work in a crop, so we can see the effects and when is the best time or the best dose to apply, just following on this temporal data, how this is the effect on the crop, okay? So, but how we first do? First, we need to define what is the question, right? Are we trying to measure growth? Are we trying to measure stress? Are we trying to measure yield? Are we trying to count stands? Only measure height or volume of the crop? So each crop has their own unique traits that depends on which crop you're working or the cycle of the crop. We need to choose on and tailor for that, right? Then we can design and work building a protocol for data collection, image data collection, right? Very important later to have, as Igor was mentioning, a way for you to measure very accurately, use RTK drones, GCPs on your field, so you can really make sure that you're collecting data consistently. After that, we can build orthomosaics and 3D products, right? We are partners with Solvi. We use Solvi most of the time to do all this work for us. So basically, we uploaded all the data there, does all the stitching and the 3D products that we segment from the images, and then we can exactly design the field map that we have there in the field, right? After that, you can extract all the traits, such as just a few examples here, canopy cover over time, or how green it is your plant over time, plant height, and especially for biomass crops that I'm going to show you one today, that is sugarcane, volume. So it's very important because it's directly correlated to yield in sugarcane, okay? And with that, we can easily compare treatments, varieties, genotypes over time, right? And really link the data that we're extracting from the images to what we're seeing in the field, right? So, and one of the traits that are very that I am asked the most is about height, right? So why is this first, why is this important, right? It's we measure height in every single crop, right? So it's a very easy to understand why we need to measure crop. But like I said, in sugarcane specifically, that is a biomass crop, it's a very important trait because it's directly correlated with yield, okay? And why is also useful? Because it's non-destructive, right? We can go there, measure, and we don't need to collect a sample to measure that particular trait, right? And we can make decisions just based on that, right? So I'm not going to go into detail. Igor already talked about how we do all the data products here, building DSM, DTM, and CHM. But one important thing to note here is that we found out that most of the actual data that we measure regularly in crops, like we said before, crops are measured different ways by different people. But usually we get better correlation when we look at the 95th percentile of the average height of your plot. You get very high correlations with field measurements in there, okay? All right, so I'm gonna go first for our first example here. So first, I'd like to mention this was a work done in collaboration with NC State University here in North Carolina, where I am located, with a collaborator here. His name is Chris Hine. He's the researcher responsible for this trial here that I'm gonna show to you. But basically, what happened here is he came to me with a challenge, right? So they have about 15 to 20 different trials all over the East Coast of United States here. Each of those trials, they range between 800 to 2,000 trees per trial. They have on the peak of the season to go and measure every single tree of their trials, right? Because tree height, it's a very important trait for them. And how do they do it? They use this equipment here called hypsometer, right? So this was actually new for me too, because I'm not from the forestry area. So basically, they have a sensor on the base of the tree, more or less on the your chest height, and then you get away from the tree where you can see the top of the tree, and you point the hypsometer to the top of the tree, and then you get an estimation based on Pythagoras here on what is the height of your tree, right? This you do in trees that are very tall. If the trees are not super tall, you can use what we call here a height pole. So basically, you just extend your pole and you can measure your tree height. But imagine doing that for that many trees that I mentioned, between 800 to 2,000 trees per trial, one by one. So basically, you need a big crew to do that and measure every single one. So he came to me with a challenge of like, can we do this with drones? I said, well, I've been doing this for quite a while, so let's work together and let's make it happen. So we went in one of his trials. So we flew Matrice 4E with only RGB sensor, and we flew an RTK mission here, and we also set it up GCP points that were surveyed with an RTK antenna, right? After this flight here, the mission plan, we uploaded all the images to Solvi, where all the image stitching, the 3D products were built. And later, we did all the plot boundaries here to be able to look at single tree level data, okay? So basically, what we were able to accomplish here with this data here, first is we were able to make a census, right? Because that's something very hard to do. When you're in a forest with very tall trees there, walking all over this plot here is not an easy task, right? So basically, we're able to see how many trees are alive, how many trees are dead. Second, is the tree alive? Okay, but what is the vigor that tree has? So we can rank the vigor based on the greenest index of that particular tree, okay? And most important, what he was looking for is tree height, right? So we are able to extract the tree height for every single tree in that particular plot, right? And what were the advantages here? So basically, it took them about 3 days and 3 crews with 3 or 4 people each crew to measure this entire trial here. And for us here with the flight, it was super quick and easy. It was a mission flight that it took us maybe 20 minutes, and we were done. Then later was just data processing and data extraction in our office, right? So we didn't need to stay out there in the field. So we really much appreciate that. But then how we make sure that that data was really accurate, right? Because the data that we had to compare before was the data measured by the hypsometer that I showed you before. So what they actually did, they cut down 24 trees and measure with the measuring tape, right? So with that, we did the correlation here between. So this first graph here on your left is showing the correlation between the height of those particular trees done with the hypsometer. So we got a very poor correlation here of 0.25. And then the height extracted from the images from the drone. So you can see here how high the correlation was. So this is one more validation here that we were able to do and show how important it is and how easy and accurate this kind of methodology is for a trait that is so important in forestry. Okay, so I'm going to move on to another example here that we have. So this example is about sugarcane, right? So the goal with this is to try to show how important and how easy it is to collect data over time with drones, right? And how can we use this powerful tool to help us characterize each variety there, right? So basically here you can see that we did repeated measurements of, in this case here, this graph is canopy cover over time. So we have days after planting on the x-axis and canopy cover percentage on the y-axis. So we can see, for example, a sugarcane here that is very vigorous in the beginning here, but it reaches the plateau of growth very early. And other varieties here are continuing growing. They have a slow vigor in the beginning here, but they don't reach the plateau so early as the other ones. So these are very important key parameters here for us to look. What is actually the phenology of growth of each of the varieties and be able to characterize, oh, this variety is very aggressive early growing, or this has a very good high yield potential because although it grows slowly in the beginning, but the yield towards the end of the season has a higher potential than the other ones. So we can define maybe early varieties, early maturing varieties, late maturing varieties, or mid maturing varieties just by looking at the growth rate and over the season. Okay. And then what we did with one of our clients here was actually to help them, to help the breeder actually, to in early stages of breeding, to select varieties out in the field. So just to give you a perspective, usually we have thousands of plants in early breeding stages where we have to select maybe 10% of those plants that we're going to start working in replicated trials to see performance of those particular genotypes. So each of these squares here is a single plant that is a unique genotype in this breeding program here. So our goal is using images, extract data by single plant and look at the growth over time to be able to select what are the best performing ones regarding speed of growth as well as vigor, right? So, and we were able to do that. And obviously, we all, as researchers, we always have checks in our field. So we can base it out on the performance of the check to see which plants are performing better than the check. And signal that to the breeder, say, hey, go take a look on these guys because they are worth looking at because they're performing better than the check. Okay, so the breeder already can go to the field with a better trained eye and look at what is really important. Okay, and so you don't need to be looking at the entire field. And with that, you can do several metrics, right? And basically calculate your selection pressure and see which families crossing families that you have that have better performance, or you want to select more or less. So you are in control of everything, but now you have metrics to support your decision here and make sure that you're taking the right decision on selections. So then I'm going to go for my third and final example here. This was another collaboration with North Carolina State University with my collaborators here, Craig Yancho and Ken Pecota. So they are the breeders responsible for the sweet potatoes here in North Carolina. It's a big crop here in North Carolina. Most of the sweet potato produced here goes to the international market, especially Europe. So it's planted all over here. But the big challenge in here that they had was in these small trials here, try to estimate yield. Why? Because it's all done manually nowadays. So basically they have to wait for the entire cycle of the growth of the plant, dig out all the sweet potatoes out in the field, pick them out, and weigh them. So this is very laborious. So basically, they're not able to evaluate every single plot or every single row that they have in there. Okay. So what did we propose here? So I said, can we estimate yield or something that we cannot see because those sweet potatoes, they're buried under the ground, right? But can use weekly flights here and look at canopy features. Can we estimate yield? And I designed a protocol where we did weekly flights. So very important on this one, we did an early flight before any growth of plant in there, where we defined the DTM. Okay, so the digital terrain model. And then later on, we did weekly flights, about 12 flights in total. Okay. Again, we did 6 ground control points along the field to be sure that every single plot will lay out on top of the exactly same plot all over the season and extract the same data. And then I extracted all the canopy features from individual plots, and we use those canopy features to build a model to estimate yield. Just looking at how fast the canopy was growing and how green the canopy was during the entire season, and also how the height of the canopy as well. Okay, so it was provided to me on this graph here on the bottom. You can see the blue bars represent the data that was provided from the field, where they actually went there and weighed the sweet potatoes out in the field. And the red bars are after we did the modeling here. So we did a modeling that is predicting right now with an R square of almost 0.8 of precision here, of total yield or bushels per acre of sweet potato. Okay, so then later we are able to go back in some of the plots that they were not able to collect data, or they didn't have time to collect the data. We're able to estimate as well the yields of the data that was not collected. So you can see here on the red bars the estimated yield for those plots. And as you can see, some of them had already yield collected from the field and some doesn't. Okay. And another very important thing here was to characterize, right, how those new varieties were growing, right? So there's 2 very well-known varieties here in North Carolina. One is Covington and the other one is Bay Bell. So Covington is a very important variety for North Carolina state, right? And most of people here know very well how Covington grows. So they know that Covington is a very slow grow plant, but it yields really well, right? And we can see that clearly here on our crop growth curves in here. So we can see Covington here is the green line, and we can see here the early stages, the vigor or the canopy cover growth percentage per day here is not that high as compared to Bay Bell or the MC180862, right? And so basically here we can see differences and be able to point like what is the growth rate per day of each of these plots here, and what is the maximum potential here is the asymptote for each of those plots in there. So basically now you have clear metrics to compare between your plots and be able to make decisions. So just to finalize here is the key takeaways from my talk here. So you could see that I used the very same workflow or very similar workflow to answer very different biological questions, right? And we can see that height, canopy cover, greenness, and volume of the plant are very, very important, and especially when we measure them over time, right? Because I always say it's a lot better to look at a movie than a single picture to have a better idea what's going on in the field and be able to compare everything, right? So the biggest delivery here that we have is not actually the image, right? But it's the data that we extract from the image. As you can see here, measuring traits over time can answer a lot of our questions that we have in field trials when we're trying to understand why one variety performs better than another, or why one variety responds better than another to a stress. Okay. So I'd like to thank everybody for the opportunity, and I will be available for questions here if you guys have
Thank
some.
you. Yes, thank you, everyone. I will help now to thank you to Igor and, of course, Thiago for the presentation. I've been monitoring some of the questions. We had a lot of questions, and we have just a bit less than 10 minutes. So, any questions that will not be answered live, we will answer to them by email. So, don't worry about that. We will take care of them. So, let me dive into some of the questions. So one that was I gave it to the first question that it was basically posted. So this is more for Igor. Do I need to fly camera in angle position for capturing height information, or even camera pointing at 90 degrees will work?
Yeah, that's a good question. Actually, there was in one of the papers that I've studied when preparing for this webinar, they have tested different camera angles as well, and found that actually I think it was like 60 degrees angle worked like produced better DSMs or point clouds and then DSMs. So I don't have like personal experience or heard from any of our users about like benefits, but it could when mapping like tall structures and buildings, it's quite common workflow to use like a nadir angle. But I guess it all depends on also specific situation.
Super. Thank you. Thank you very much, Igor. And just one that was also posted very early related to some of the elevation models that you showed is, are these elevation models constructed using LiDAR?
Oh no, that's photogrammetry only, which means they are created from just from images. And that's actually a very interesting topic in itself. So LiDAR can also be used for crop height measurements and has its benefits. But also, as I was studying some papers, there are some cases where the one works better than the other, so it's not as straightforward. I don't know. Maybe you, Thiago, have experience of using LiDAR?
A little bit, but what I used to tell is like sometimes I try to favor simpler sensors like RGB that is easier to set up a protocol for data collection and data processing than LiDAR. LiDAR is an amazing tool, and like you said, for some settings, it's better to use LiDAR. But as you saw in my examples there, all those traits, especially height traits, were extracted from RGB images. And with RGB, you can also extract other traits in not only height, right? So that's the biggest advantage that I think on RGB can pose.
Okay, great. And there was actually one question I saw that I think would be interesting to address Thiago as well. If there are any benefits of using ground control points together with like RTK. So in this forestry study, you use both. So have you seen any need for GCPs, or do you think just RTK drone would have worked well?
So for very accurate height measurements, we prefer to use GCPs. Even RTK, the accuracy of height can be a few centimeters off. So because this is research level data, we prefer to use RTK flight as well as GCPs. And on top of that, also GCPs help us with the temporal data, right? Because when you collect data over time, it's very important for you to lay out your plot boundaries exactly where the previous flights were. So the GCPs will help you doing that. And sometimes you don't have access to RTK where you are as well.
Okay,
Very good.
perfect.
Thank
Uh,
you. Go
yeah,
ahead. Go ahead. Go ahead.
anything you, Matteo, would like to bring up? You've been working closely. looking closely at the
Oh,
questions.
no. That's perfectly fine. Thank you. Thank you, Thiago. Quick question that just got popped in that I think it's interesting one, mostly for Igor, I would say. Is a camera with global shutter improving the height measurement? I think this is an interesting maybe question to address.
Yeah, that's interesting. Actually, I don't have experience with like looking specifically into that, so can't talk really to that.
Okay, so
But
let me.
obviously, just like quality of the imagery obviously affects the quality of the DSMs. So I would guess that with the rolling shutter, if you get some like blurriness in the imagery, that will ultimately affect the accuracy of the DSMs and then height measurements, but don't have any like quantitative numbers on that. And then there was also, I think, a few questions that mentioned like something along the lines like if you have like very thin structures of the canopy. So that's in general like also I would say the weak side of photogrammetry. So it does not capture like very accurately, like for example, years of the wheat plants. So it works better when it's like solid canopy structure, leaves. The denser, the better. But if you want to look like at very, very tiny, small details and measure them, it can be quite challenging.
Another one that we can tackle as we're almost on top of the hour. That is basically both for you, Thiago and Igor. What is the experience of large canopy trees like almonds or hazelnuts?
So I have a, sorry, Igor, let me.
Oh, go ahead.
We have done some work. Well, one of the examples that I showed was in forestry, in pine trees. We have done some work also in citrus. And we have very good accuracy on measuring height on those crops. Like Igor mentioned before on one of the questions, uh, changing the angle of the camera can help in photogrammetry to measure height, as well as your mapping pattern. Looking at like a grid pattern of mapping that also increases the number of pictures that you're taking, basically the area, and you get more accurate heights and volumes of your object that you're trying to measure.
Very good. And probably this will be the last question. And as I said, the rest of the questions, if we cannot address them, they will be answered by email. We've got a call. We've got a question from Pavel. There is the assumption of two flights, bare fall and full height. Is it recommended to do both flights at the same altitude?
Hmm. I think it's not like critical to be the exact same altitude. So both like in the range, I think I mentioned in one of the slides, like what we've seen works best is somewhere between like 30 to 50 meters. It doesn't have to be low. And actually, I think there was another question like why you shouldn't fly low. So I wanted to clarify. So flying low above the tall crops is when usually you will have problems. So for example, a typical a corn trial with corn plants being 2 or 3 meters long. When you fly very low, like 12 meters above the which you can fly as the lowest with Mavic 3M, the crops on the sides of the images will be seen from the sides, so the effective like overlapping area becomes much smaller. So even if you set overlap to like 85%, uh, so first of all, like in many cases, the stitching will fail because it will not just be able to match the images together in all situations. But then also tall crops can move if it's a little bit windy, which will make like the same plants look different in the neighboring overlapping images. So that also makes stitching challenging. So I think it was primarily like cases like this, and there is really no benefit of flying very low for height measurements. Like the resolution of the imagery that you get at 30 or 40 or 50 even meters or 60 That example with sugarcane, I think, was 60 meters altitude. It's more than enough for accurate height measurements, so there is no really benefits in flying lower.
Okay, very good. Any closing remarks, maybe Igor, as we are on top of the hour?
Yeah, as Matteo mentioned, we will get back with all unanswered questions probably next week. But yeah, you have our contact details if you have any specific questions, maybe to Thiago. So feel free to contact him or me personally. And then if you're using drone imagery and would like to try it out on your own with your own projects, feel free to sign up for a free trial on Solvi's website and give it a try. And yeah, with that, I would like to thank everyone who joined us today, and thank you, Matteo and Thiago, for the presentation and for assisting answering our questions. And we'll see everyone next time. Bye.
Thank you.